Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Park Cities Rotary Club. We're going to call the meeting to order. I'd like to ask everyone to rise. And obviously, I want to spend a little time in meeting and greeting your fellow Rotarians and any new members. So take a few minutes, and then we'll get on with the program. Okay, everyone, we're going to get the show on the road. And as we take a seat, we're going to ask Barbara MARCUM to come on up and do the invocation and the Pledge of Allegiance.
Hello, well, glad you're here. And at this time, we're just going to invite you, if you have a concern, go ahead and sit if you're ready. A concern, and we will receive that. Yeah. Okay, and her first name is? Maggie. Okay, thank you. Here's somebody.
I'm going to take care of Jefferson. I'm going to take Jeff's announcement here. If you guys can keep Eric Nadell with the Rangers in your prayers, he's been out this season with depression. We have a card that's going around the table, and whoever ends up with it last, I'm going to wait here and I'll take it at the end. And if you wouldn't mind signing, we'd sure appreciate that. We just want to let him know we're thinking about him. He's been here several times. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I learned from my wife last night, a dear friend of ours in Capella, Peggy Smotherman, who was our 8th grade teacher for our kids in school, and her husband, Bill, and Peggy, we've known for over 30 years. They're very active in the Lions Club. They're actually the ones that came to Lion. She's suffering from cancer. They just discovered it while they were in Hawaii a month ago. She's about 70. Last night, she was coming home from the doctor's office in front of their house, fell down. So they had to call the ambulance and take her back to the hospital. So if you could have her prayers for Peggy Smotherman, we would appreciate that.
Thank you. Anybody else? Here's another.
So prayers for my brother Greg. He was recently diagnosed with multiple systems atrophy, which is similar to ALS. Not a great diagnosis. So, but he's being accepted in a drug trial, which
Thank you.
is good.
Thank you.
Well, Alan Wynn and Jill Jordan, who ran the parade, and Alan did a great job, but there towards the end, then I comment on, man, he must be hot because he's really sweating. Do you all know he just had 5-way bypass? I mean, has that been, I didn't know that was, I didn't see an email about that or anything, but people are nodding their head like you knew, but just wanted to make sure.
Thank you. Yeah, for her, on her mother's passing. Not yet, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Any others? All right, well, let us pray. Oh God, you've heard the prayers of your people, some of them, but we all have a prayer in our heart. This day we hear especially about news of a new diagnosis. We hear about one suffering depression. We hear about accidents on someone who has already had great challenges. We hear about the loss of Siobhan's mother, and again, so soon after her dear father's. Much loss for a young woman, and her brother's death not so many years ago. We hear about sickness and concerns, and we are concerned. We know that you hear all the prayers of your people, and that you deeply reside with them in their hearts. Oh God, be with all of these, and be with those that are unspoken prayers this day. Well, God, we have all gathered once again in this wonderful room on this last Friday in July, and we have a grateful heart that we're the ones that are able to be here in person, and we celebrate that we're united in our purpose. For through this club, we come to personally understand how together we can do so much more in our community and world than we could do on our own. And today, loving God, we remember there are so many people in the world who are suffering under climate issues. Our hearts are with the people of Greece who've been fleeing for their lives. We also know there are other climate dramas in our U.S. with flooding and hail and unheard of experiences with such high heat. We're thankful for the responders, those first responders who go to attend to these people. God, you've given us a world with such varied and rich histories. Help us to know our own authentic history and to know when persons seek to revise our history. In the hope that we not repeat previous mistakes, oh God, we need to be knowledgeable. In this day, we're grateful for the early Rotarians whose service to community and world can't be distorted. In our transparency as a service group, we are made better. Thank you for the truth and service of our great Rotarian life. In your holy name we've gathered this day. Amen. We'll pledge at this time.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic which stands one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you, everyone, for their concerns. And again, if anyone has any information about Alan, I've talked to him after his surgery, and he was having some difficulty, but he understands what he has up in the future as far as his recovery. So please reach out to him if you could, and just give him a call. I know he'd appreciate it. Also, it's worth noting, Herb Durham's passing. He was a great individual, one of the great generation. If you saw his obituary this last Sunday in the paper, just an amazing man. So we do appreciate that. Like to request any happy bucks? Anybody have happy bucks? Any happy bucks? First, last time. Okay. Introduction of guest. We have any guest? Here we go.
Hello, I'm Mary Bishop. As you guys know, I was in charge of the bike parade along with Daniel. And my guest today was our grand prize winner, REESE GOULD. And I'd like for you all to give him a round of applause. And also his mother and his sister, Kate, are here just to celebrate with him his accomplishment.
I'm joined by my wife, Carolyn Ray, and at our next anniversary will be 55 years.
Woo-hoo.
I'm really thrilled to introduce Andrea Robinson. She's a community volunteer, retiree. She sought out our club on her own. We're her second Rotary Club that she's visited, so please be sure to greet her. Thank you.
You picked the best club to come to. Okay. Thanks, Richard. I'd like to call up Mary Bishop now to talk about our marketplace advertiser.
We have Chris Clausen today is our sponsor for the marketplace, and I asked Richard to come up with him. I don't know if some of you haven't met Chris, but he is such a genuine person. I mean, he is a person that when you have concerns for your loved ones, you could turn to him. You might not have to use his service, but he will give you great and wise advice. So Chris' company has you can hire them for 4 hours or round-the-clock shifts. Because of his personality and his dedication to those in need or in pain, he hires the very best he can find of caregivers. and they stay with him because of who he is and what kind of company he runs. And I think that all of us, I know I've had my mother, she lived with us for 4 years. Barbara's mother lived with her for 4 years. But other loved ones, like my aunts, needed to go into a place. They needed at home what they call age in place people, but at a certain point they had to move. And Chris has been able to handle all the type of things, and that many different ways he could help. I wanted,
I went to Chris when my father-in-law was failing. During the last 2 years of his life, Chris coordinated his care at home. Of course, Chris also, he didn't have to, but Chris also helps people once they have to leave home find the right place to be. Next week, I'll be meeting with Chris to help me help a friend of mine get on Medicaid for Medicaid assisted living. So he can do a lot of things, and he's been a great blessing to me.
Also, Reese is a very special friend to me. I've known him since he was a little boy, and his mother's a good friend of mine. We worked at the church, Highland Park Methodist, together. And he, for the last 2 years, has decorated his bike. This year he added this full costume, and it was hot. So on top of his clothes, he had this Uncle Sam outfit. And he also bikes with a boom box, so he brings music to the parade. And so he's been our grand prize winner for the last 2 years. And so, Barbara, would you hand Reese this gift on the table? This is this stack. It's a gift, and you might know it's from the bike shop. Reese, it's from the bike shop, and it's a new pair of bike gloves. So y'all give me another hand.
Thank you, Barbara. Mary, and Reese, you know, I'm a cyclist, so keep on riding that bike, and that was a great 2 years in a row. That's incredible. Also, now we have some announcements just to make sure everyone's familiar with. Tuesday, August 8th, the Rotary means business happy hour. And then Happy can provide more details, but we're at the 12 Cuts Brazilian Steakhouse. That's Friday, September 11th. And there should be no Friday meeting. It's Labor Day weekend. It's the first time I've heard about it, unfortunately, but that sounds very good. And so now, like Pat Martin, we're going to draw for our raffle. What's the amount up to now again, Lori? $16.94. So if you haven't bought your raffle tickets, this is your last chance to do it. So we want our speaker today to draw the winning number, hopefully. So if you are the holder of ticket 4534, you have your chance to come up here and see if you win. Woohoo! And guys, your odds keep getting better because we're down to about half the deck. Can someone audit that ticket number real quick just to make sure? You still have to draw, yes. Okay. Hold on 1 second here. Four-way test, you passed. 8, and she has to pick the ace of spades to win half the pot. You're still a winner. Good card. Well, guys, we're going to keep moving on with the deck. So next week, you should be more incentivized to buy a ticket because it's going to be getting better chances to win this thing. Hey, we're trying to conserve. We're trying to go green, I think, aren't we here at Rotary? Richard Stanford, chair of the day.
Sam Haynes is a professor of history at the University of Texas at Arlington. He also directs the Center for Greater Southwest Studies. I'll get it right this time. His new book is a crown jewel of our re-understanding our own Texas history. You know, people say if you don't know where you've come from, you don't know where you're going. And I grew up in a whitewashed Texas where the stories of the Tejanos, the Mexicans like Lorenzo de Zavala, the free blacks, the Indians like the Cherokees, we didn't hear about. I heard about Bowie, Crockett, Travis, you know, all that stuff. And it's important, but we live in a time that if we're going to understand Texas diversity, we need to know the diversity of the Republic and during the time of the Revolution. It's eye-opening, and it's all true. Like I say, this book is a groundbreaker. It's won the best book from the Texas Historical Commission. It's won best book from Foreign Affairs. It's Texas Institute of Letters has recognized it. It's really, for those who love the history of Texas and want to understand where we really came from, Sam has contributed more than anybody in recent years. So please welcome Sam Haynes.
Okay, thanks for inviting me. And thank you again, Richard. I'm getting to the point where I think I should make Richard my agent. He's been great. So what I thought I would do is it's 12:20 now. I'll talk for about 20 minutes or so, or maybe more, or 20 minutes and then Q&A. I'm happy to do as much Q&A as you'd like. So raise the microphone. I could hold it. How's that? Okay. Everybody? You guys can hear me? Now what am I doing? Am I too close? Okay. All right. So, as Richard said, I do teach at UT Arlington. Last year I came out with a book, Unsettled Land, From Revolution to Republic, The Struggle for Texas. And when I pitched the book to my publisher, I said, look, it's important to understand that in 1836, when the revolution takes place, half the people in Texas are people of color. And yet, all of the books that you're aware of, I'm sure, about the Texas Revolution that I'm aware of, focus on the same people. And I'll just tell you, when as an icebreaker, when I teach Texas history at UTA, and I do this every year, I have students write down on a piece of paper 3 historical figures in Texas. And they've all taken 7th grade, the vast majority of them have. And so I don't tabulate them, I'm just really want to get a discussion going. And I'm always, well, I'm no longer amazed. It's always the same people, always the same people. If I did tabulate them, certainly Stephen F. Austin would be number 1, Sam Houston would be number 2, and Davy Crockett would be number 3. And Davy Crockett was here 9 weeks before he dies at the Alamo. So if we want to call him a Texan, fine, but I think probably better, more accurate to call him an honorary Texan. But they never mention Tejanos. They never mention Native American figures. And so when I pitched the book, I tried to tell my editor in New York, I said, look, there's more going on than just a 13-day siege at the Alamo. This is a really complex society, and we need to understand it as such. And so they said, great. And Richard's heard this story before, but when at the end of the editing process, the art department sent me the cover art, and I opened the PDF, and to my horror, it was a picture of the Alamo with the smoke rising from the walls. And I said, no, this really isn't going to work. I have 4 pages on the Alamo. I don't want to tell you that Sam Houston's not in there. He is in there, of course, as is David Crockett, as is Stephen F. Austin. But also, I tried to recover the voices of people who aren't as well known, but should be. Okay, I want to make that clear. They're not as well known, but we have ignored them. And so, you be the judge. I'm going to talk about 3 people today who you may have heard of, but probably know little about. Some of them don't. One of them makes it into the Texas history textbooks, but the other 2 don't, I don't think. And I spend a lot of time on them. I think they're important. So the first person I'm going to talk about, and I don't have actually, of the 3 people, I only have pictures for one of them. Is that, there we go. Oh boy. Okay, well that's a rather small map. Let me just describe why I put this on on my PowerPoint. I want to talk about a Cherokee leader named Richard Fields, who comes to Texas in the 18-teens. Now, you may think that all Native Americans in Texas are indigenous, and they are not. When I talk about indigenous tribes, I'm talking about the Caddos. I'm talking about the Karankawas, people like the Coyoltecans in Central Texas. These are not indigenous people. These are people who came to Texas in the early 1800s. Now, you've probably heard of the Trail of Tears. The Trail of Tears takes place in 1839. It's the forced relocation of Cherokees westward. This is taking place before that. There are literally dozens of treaties between the U.S. government and state governments and Native American tribes. And these tribes cede their land and they move west. And some of them move into Texas. And one of the Cherokees who moves to Texas in about 1819 or 1820 is a man named Richard Fields. I start my book with the Cherokees. You might think we're talking about the early 1820s, we would be talking about Stephen F. Austin and the Old 300. I don't really get to Austin until chapter 4. Because the Cherokees are coming earlier, and they're coming in larger numbers than Stephen F. Austin and the colonists on his impresario grant. So Richard Fields is a mixed-race Cherokee, and in many ways thinks differently than other Cherokees. He had speculated in lands back in Tennessee, and when he arrives in East Texas, and Cherokee country, boy, you really have to know your East Texas geography to know what I'm talking about, but between the Angelina and the Neches rivers, that's Cherokee country. And when he gets there, he realizes something that most Cherokees had really not thought of. They are squatters. They have no right to the land on which they are living. And when he arrives, Texas is still part of New Spain, and shortly thereafter, the first Mexican Republic is established. And what he wants to do is make sure that the Mexican government will recognize the Cherokee homeland. So he goes to Mexico City with another chief who I also talk about quite a lot in the book, a man named Chief Bowles. And they go to Mexico City in the early 1820s, and they meet Stephen F. Austin there, and they meet other impresarios there. And they're asking for exactly the same thing. They want a land grant on which they can settle and live peacefully. The Mexican government isn't very keen. It's a bit complicated, but the short answer is simply this. It took a lot of money to be an impresario. You had to have pretty deep pockets. Cherokees did not have deep pockets. They were simply broke. And so in 1822, the Mexican government says, don't call us, we'll call you. They sort of send them packing. They don't tell them no, but then they don't tell them yes either. And Richard Fields goes back to Cherokee country, and this is where it gets kind of difficult to explain because we really don't have much in the way of a written record. He does exactly the opposite of what the Mexican government had told him to do. He goes back to Cherokee country, apparently announces to the people there that this has been an astonishing success, that he has been given title to the land on which they are now living. Not only that, but he has the right to recruit Indians from other areas, like above the Red River is U.S. Indian territory. A lot of Cherokees living there, Shawnees, Delawares, and so on. And he goes on a recruiting mission, and he's doing exactly the same thing that other impresarios are doing. He just doesn't have the support of the Mexican government. They are completely oblivious to what this man is doing in East Texas in 1822. So this goes on for about a year or so, and then he finally announces to the local Mexican officials, my name is Richard Fields. I am a superior chief of the Indians, which appears to have been a completely made-up title. And I represent 20 tribes, and we'd be very happy to negotiate with you. And this sparks a series of, if you're a historian, pretty hilarious letters, because they write back to San Antonio and then to Mexico City. Have you ever heard of this guy? Because he says he's got the right to live here, and he's recruiting Indians from all over. So the letters finally get down to Mexico City, and the Interior Minister, Lucas Alamán, who had met with Fields, he knows who Fields is, and he said, yes, that's the guy who we told to go home a year and a half ago. And so they're quite upset. And the long and the short of it is that Richard Fields, his request for land is denied. He actually makes a second attempt. He will send an emissary down to Mexico City the following year to make the same requests, and that is rebuffed. So what is Richard Fields really playing at? We don't really know. There was an article written about Fields back in the early 1900s and took a very patronizing view and said that, well, you know, Richard Fields he did the best that the Cherokees knew how. In other words, he's this sort of simple child of the forest who, you know, it clearly got lost in translation what the Mexican government was asking of him. I really don't accept that thesis. Richard Fields had speculated in land. He had worked and done business with American land speculators. My theory, and it's really just that because we just don't have enough written evidence, my theory was he just decided to disregard the Mexican government and to present the Mexican government with a fait accompli, that there are now, and indeed there were, thousands of Indians living in East Texas. What are you going to do about it? The Mexican government really didn't have the resources to dislodge them. And so I think that's what he's banking on, that he would present them with this fait accompli and that they would be able to come to terms. But when he is rebuffed twice, then he gets angry and he collaborates with Anglo-American land speculators in East Texas. And they declare independence. And this is the first independence, well, it's actually the second Declaration of Independence. There had been another one during the Mexican War for Independence. But it's called the Fredonian. He creates a new state called the Republic of Fredonia. It is short-lived. He has told his Anglo-American collaborators that he has the support of these other tribes living in East Texas. He is, after all, the superior chief of the Indians, or so he says. Once the republic is proclaimed, then he starts to get support among these tribes and finds there's absolutely none. And the Cherokees are somewhat horrified by what he's done, and they realize that now their position in East Texas is seriously jeopardized because he has really antagonized the Mexican government by declaring independence. And so they have him executed, as well as some of his Confederates. But the support for a Cherokee homeland, legal title to a Cherokee homeland, that continues for years and years. And that is, for me, one of the more poignant subplots of the book. The Cherokees want the Mexican government to give them legal title. They're ultimately unsuccessful. Then they hope that the new Anglo government, after the revolution, will give them legal title. And they had very good reason to think that because they actually signed a treaty with Sam Houston, which they were told they would be given legal title, and that treaty was not ratified by the Texas Senate. So it all goes wrong for the Cherokees, and you may or may not know, you will know if you know your Texas history, that in 1839 the Cherokees are expelled in rather brutal fashion by Mirabeau Lamar. But Richard Fields is this amazing character. I think of him in somewhat, I used to read Joseph Conrad as a kid, and if you know your Heart of Darkness or Lord Jim, here is this guy in the wilds of East Texas. It is in the middle of nowhere, the forests of this primeval forest, and he's trying to create this pan-Indian empire, and it goes horribly wrong. So that's how I start the book. The next figure you may have heard of, perhaps should have heard of. The man on the left is Lorenzo de Zavala. And Lorenzo de Zavala was, he always shows up in Texas history textbooks, but in a very brief way. I didn't know that much about him until I started writing the book, and I've taught Texas history for decades. But he's always characterized as a Yucatan intellectual, a Federalist, and an opponent of Santa Anna, who happens to be in Texas during the Revolution, and so he'll sign the Declaration of Independence, and there are very few Mexicans or Tejanos at that meeting at Washington on the Brazos, so he's induced to serve as the provisional vice president of Texas. And that's pretty much all you get about Lorenzo de Zavala. But when I was writing the book, I realized how important he was, because the Texas Revolution is really a Mexican story before it becomes an American one. And you have to understand Mexican politics to understand what finally happens. And Lorenzo de Zavala and the man to his right, to our right, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, this is an astonishing political relationship. They are friends, very, very close friends and allies. I'm not going to go into the weeds of Mexican politics, but in 1828 they conspire to overthrow the government. Then they become enemies again, and Zavala is forced into exile. And then friends paved the way for his return, and things seem to be going pretty well. And Zavala is minister to Paris in 1834, the Mexican minister to Paris, when Santa Anna abolishes the Constitution. And Zavala was a constitutionalist, he was a federalist, great admirer of American institutions. He was absolutely furious. And he writes a very tactful letter of resignation, but that same day writes a blistering, what we would call an op-ed, which is published in the Mexican newspapers. And he says, "You've torn the Constitution to pieces." He's immediately recalled, and he has no intention of going to Mexico City because he doesn't know what awaits him there. He knows that Santa Anna is very angry. So he says, "I'm going to retire. I'm going to take up the life of the country squire. I've bought land in Texas. That's what I'm going to do next." Nobody in Mexico City believed him because he was the most important leader of the political opposition in Mexico in the mid-1830s. And so when he declares his intention to go to Texas, they assume, and correctly, that he is going to establish the resistance movement there. He's going to make Texas a beachhead of opposition to the Santa Anna regime. So his arrival in the summer of '35 is absolutely crucial to understanding this rebellion when it finally takes place a few months later. And there are all kinds of things that I think that Zavala influences that we'd never really thought of before. The Mexican army, as we all know, is launched, and it moves into Texas and will eventually reach San Antonio and lay siege to the Alamo. We all know this story, and then ultimately move on to defeat at San Jacinto. That army, that campaign is organized months earlier than we had originally thought, and that's because once Zavala arrives, his presence in Texas just really strikes fear. There are all kinds of alarm bells set off in Mexico City as a result, because they know who he is. They do not know who William Barrett Travis is. They do not know who James Bowie was. But they knew who Lorenzo de Zavala was. He had been one of the most important figures in Mexico for over a decade. So that's why the campaign is launched. And then later, and also I would say, and I don't have any direct evidence for this, but one of the interesting mysteries of the Texas Revolution was, why did Santa Anna go himself? He was the president. He certainly didn't have to go. He could have delegated this to his command staff. But if you know Santa Anna, then it makes a lot of sense, because they were now bitter, bitter enemies. He was his nemesis, and Zavala was his nemesis, and Santa Anna wanted to bring him back to Mexico City in chains. And that's why, when Santa Anna reaches the banks of the Brazos River, he knows that Houston's army is just a few miles to the north. But he also knows that Zavala is about 50 miles to the east with the Texas government. And I'm putting that in air quotes because the Texas government is really Zavala, who was the vice president, and David G. Burnett, who was the president. And they were on 2 mules headed to Harrisburg. That was the Texas government. And so if you think that Sam Houston defeats the Mexican army at San Jacinto, well, to be clear, he only defeats about a quarter of it, because Santa Anna, when he reaches the Brazos, which is during the rainy season, it's almost impossible. It takes them weeks to get across. He's one of the first to do so, and it's on the east bank that he learns that Zavala is moving to Harrisburg, and he suddenly takes off with a few hundred men, leaving everybody else to try to ferry across, not telling his generals what he has done. And at first, Sam Houston's very confused. He thinks he's trying to sort of move up behind him. And then finally he realizes, no, Santa Anna has moved on. He is going to East Texas. He's on his way to Harrisburg. The only explanation is he wants to bring Zavala back to Mexico City in chains. Of course, spoiler alert, that doesn't happen. Santa Anna is defeated at San Jacinto. I'm not going to go into any more detail about this relationship except to say that there is another chapter after San Jacinto because they were bitter enemies, and Zavala arrives a few days after the battle at San Jacinto, and he immediately wants to have Santa Anna executed like everybody else in the Texas Army except Sam Houston, apparently. But as the days go on, he becomes more and more sympathetic to this man who they had done so much together in Mexico over the course of the last decade. And he begins to see Santa Anna, he begins to pity him. And I'll end there with that relationship. But it is a remarkable story, and we simply can't understand the Texas Revolution without understanding the relationship between these two men. I'm talking about Anglo-American historians who really dominated the history of the period for over 100 years, made it all about us. What's William Barrett Travis doing? What's James Bowie doing? What's Sam Houston doing? Santa Anna was worried about what Lorenzo de Zavala was doing, and we need to understand that. Okay, and the third one, briefly, you won't be able to read the legend on the historical marker. The third one is William Goyens. And William Goyens, I talk about him, I think, in the first chapter. And then he shows up again and again and again. And I talk about him in the last chapter. It is a remarkable career. William Goyens is a free person of color, and he is living in Nacogdoches in the 18-teens. We're not quite sure how he gets there. I have a few theories, but I didn't put them in the book. But we know he's from North Carolina, and we know he was the son of a free black man and a white woman who was probably an indentured servant in the low country of North Carolina in the 1700s. And so he arrives in Nacogdoches in the 18-teens, and he's a blacksmith by trade, and he sets up shop there. And he proves to be this astonishingly successful businessman. He opens an inn in town. Then he opens, I'm not going to have these in their correct order, but he starts buying up land, starts speculating in land. On some of that land, he builds a sawmill and then a grist mill. He is one of the most important, if not the most important businessman in Nacogdoches in the 1820s and 30s. He's very litigious. He represents himself in court. He campaigns, not for himself for political office, but he campaigns for others. This is during the Mexican Republic period, of course, when he's allowed to do so. But the Sabine River is the boundary between Mexico and Texas. And he is clearly aware about what that boundary means. And if he wasn't before, he certainly was, and I can't remember the exact year. He has a carting trade in addition to all of his other enterprises. He ships goods from Nacogdoches to Natchitoches in Louisiana. And he's on one of those trips driving mules laden with Indian furs into Natchitoches, and he's arrested as a runaway slave. And he's not, of course, a runaway slave. He'd been born a free black man. And it's also pretty clear that in Natchitoches, he was quite well known, so they knew he was not a runaway slave. But to escape, he is forced to, and he did own slaves of his own. It was essentially an extortion scheme. He buys a slave and he transfers the deed over to the people who are responsible for his enslavement. So William Goyens is not just important as a businessman, however. He was also, because he was from North Carolina, and there's a Cherokee connection there that's kind of obscure, but he's from North Carolina and he apparently speaks Cherokee fluently. And he is very, very important in paving, in cementing the relationship between the Cherokees, remember, just above Nacogdoches, between the Neches and the Angelina, and the rebel government. He is sent into Indian country to negotiate. And he continues to be really important, particularly to Sam Houston. Sam Houston, as the first president, one of the very first things that he does is appoint William Goyens a land agent. I'm sorry, not a land, an Indian agent. And he will be the most important, really the only figure negotiating with all of those tribes in East Texas that I talked about a minute ago. Okay, Richard Fields is now dead, of course, but by this time, you have all of these tribes that really are assuming that the Anglo government is going to give them a homeland. That ultimately proves unsuccessful. But William Goyens is a great example, I think, of how the lives of free people of color change after the Texas Revolution. I mean, we think of the Texas Revolution as a struggle for freedom, and indeed it was for Anglo-Americans, but not for someone like William Goyens, because for William Goyens it meant the loss of freedom. Because in 1840, the Texas government passes a law expelling all free blacks. Now, to be clear, it's almost impossible to enforce, and I really can't find anyone who was actually expelled from Texas on the basis of that law. But William Goyens thought he was going to be kicked out, and he was obliged to get, he had very, very powerful friends in the Texas government. He knew Sam Houston intimately, also Thomas Jefferson Ruskin, other businessmen in Nacogdoches, and they will draft a memorial on his behalf. And so the Texas Congress will pass a law exempting William Goyens from that expulsion law. And when he dies in the 1850s, he owns about 12,000 acres of land in and around Nacogdoches. It's a remarkable success story. But he is also one of the people that I want to talk about in the book. Finding information about Goyens was very difficult because he doesn't have a diary, doesn't write letters. But as I mentioned a minute ago, he is litigious as hell. And if you go into the Nacogdoches archives, you can find lawsuits aplenty that he is filing. And you can just you can piece together his business career by looking at those lawsuits. And that's what I tried to do with William Goyens. William Goyens does get a centennial marker in 1936 to honor the 100th anniversary of the Texas Revolution. You may have seen these all over the state. I think more than 100 were made. William Goyens got one, and you can't see the legend below at the bottom there. It's all wrong. According to the marker, he was born a slave. He was not. In South Carolina, he was not. That he dies in 1836, he certainly did not. But he does get a marker. Now, I will also point out, and again, it's not a very big screen, and so if you want to look at it later, you can. And you can also see this online. The marker was vandalized, and it was literally broken at the base and has since been repaired. Why was it vandalized? I don't know. Was it racially motivated? I suspect that it was, but I don't know. And I know it was vandalized after 1968, and I actually have somebody at the center working on this at the moment, trying to figure out why the monument was vandalized, if we know any more about that. And it was also moved into downtown Nacogdoches. It's near the courthouse today. Okay? So those are the three people that I wanted to talk about, and I wanted to keep it short, but I just want to end with one thing, and that is, and this is really the takeaway from the book. I don't want you to leave today without thinking, well, that's interesting. He told us about 3 people of color in Texas, and all we knew about Sam Houston, Stephen F. Austin. What you cannot do, and what the book tries to argue, you cannot take that traditional narrative and just insert people of color. What you need to do is understand the free black experience, or the experience of the enslaved, or the experiences of Cherokees, or the experience of Mexicans and Tejanos. You need to understand those stories in and of themselves, in their own right. And so what I tried to do in the book was weave all of those narratives together and see what came out at the end. And even I was surprised by the extent to which that traditional narrative changed. So that's my brief talk, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Okay.
There's a question right there. I'm sorry, we'll get to you in a minute.
Most of what you talked about is East Texas. As you move towards the west through Texas, what are some of the names of the people that are west and central Texas and west Texas? I just read a book about Charles Goodnight and Quanah Parker, and the Comanches were some bad dudes, and nobody wanted to tramp through that territory. But I'm just curious, if you move through Texas to the west, then what are some of the names of the people that you write about?
Okay. Sure. What are some of the other people that I write about outside of East Texas? One of the Native Americans that I talk about, not Quanah Parker, because my book ends in the 1850s. He was born, but he doesn't become chief till later, is a man who the Anglos know as Buffalo Hump, Patsana Quahip. He was a Pennateca Comanche. And boy, it was difficult finding out about him too. But he is one of the most famous war chiefs, and if you are familiar with the Council House fight in San Antonio in 1840, that he was not there, but it leads him to embark upon the Great Comanche Raid. He is sort of the mastermind of the Great Comanche Raid, and it is this raid in the summer of 1840 where Comanches, it's the largest raid in American history between Native Americans and Anglos. And over 1,000 Native Americans sweep down through the Guadalupe Valley and then head home. Traditionally, that story has been characterized as an American victory because they were sort of defeated or routed or dispersed at Plum Creek. And I take a somewhat different view, and that's because the Buffalo Hump and other Comanches all wanted one thing, and that was to keep Anglos off the low plains, off the Edwards Plateau. And after 1840, there are no Anglos on the low plains, the Edwards Plateau, for about 7 or 8 years. So in that sense, I think the Great Comanche Raid was something of a success. But ultimately, of course, they are pushed off. And by the 1850s, Buffalo Hump is in Kansas on a reservation. Okay? So I do spend time on other Native American groups. But in East Texas, I talk about the Cherokees and Shawnees and the Delawares and others.
Good afternoon.
Hi.
First of all, thank you for being here.
Sure.
And I guess I just really had more of a comment. I wanted to tell you thank you for your efforts in telling these stories. Often, being a person of color, we find that many of our stories aren't being told, or as the example that you gave with the tombstone, they're being told inaccurately. And while it may be, a little comical to some people, it's really emotional to just think that my ancestors could have lived and contributed to Texas history, and their stories are being, changed, for lack of a better word. So I really
Right.
just wanted to tell you how much I appreciate you
Thanks.
making the effort today. Thank you.
Thanks.
She actually stimulated part of what I was thinking. As a historian, you touched on this. There seems to be a lot of opposition to doing scientific method with regard to history, to change it more accurately to what actually happened. Would you mind commenting about that and maybe giving your opinion about why that's happening? Because it's very perplexing to me about why we don't want to know the truth and why we don't want to do what you've done. So if you would comment on that, please.
Well, I mean, that's a great question. I'm not really sure that I know how to answer it. I do think that people gravitate to the stories that they are interested in and the stories that they want to hear. And for 100 years, starting in the early 1900s with Eugene Barker, all historians were white men. That began to change when I was in grad school. but not until grad school. I mean, you know, that was in the late 80s. They were all white men. And who did they write about? They wrote about white men. How'd that happen? So the fact is that, you know, I think as the historical community becomes more inclusive, and it certainly began to, once women started to get PhDs, the history of the family suddenly became a fascinating and a really hot topic in historical circles. But after, you know, 75, 80 years of scholarship by men, the history of the family was never mentioned. As Tejanos began to get PhDs, then suddenly the treatment of Tejanos in the 30s and 40s began to be talked about for the very, very first time. So, yeah, I think you may have heard this term before, and I was thinking about this driving in. Have you ever heard the term presentist? Because you see it a lot now, particularly among people who disagree with my scholarship and some of the scholarship of others. What they say is, but you're taking the texts that we know today and you're applying it to the past. And I do have a problem with that. I'm happy to discuss that, you know, with people who feel otherwise. But I think all history is presentist. It was presentist in the 20th century when white men were writing about white men. But I think also there's nothing wrong with that necessarily. I mean, for the simple reason that Texas was ethnically diverse in the 1830s. If it hadn't been ethnically diverse in the 1830s, I wouldn't have a problem with the Anglo-centric narrative. But when you tell people this may have been the most ethnically and racially diverse place in North America, then that is gobsmacking. And it is because, well, all I know is Stephen F. Austin and Sam Houston and David Crockett. I know a handful of white guys. And so that's the problem, I think. So having that perspective today, I'm not going to stand up here and say this inclusive Texas that we live in didn't affect my scholarship in any way. It probably did. And to be perfectly honest, and to your comment, when I'm teaching at UTA, where many of my students are people of color, and does it help when I can tell them about people other than Sam Houston? Does it make it more engaging when I can tell them about people other than Stephen F. Austin? Yeah, it does. It really does. So.
Okay, we're going to get two more questions. Jack gets it, and then Tom gets it. Okay.
Sam,
If anybody else has any questions, I'm happy to stay. Go ahead.
I like you, Sam. You're another Sam I like, so thank you for your presentation. Okay. I want to take us after the Revolution, 1836, the period of time 1836 to 1845. I know in the Profiles in Courage by John F. Kennedy talked about then Senator Sam Houston and how Sam Houston wanted to bring the Republic of Texas into the United States. My question to you, being a historian and a director of your center, are there people who were against that? They said, we won our republic, let's keep it a republic.
Yeah.
Do you
That's
have any opinions on whether there was an attempt to keep it a republic forever?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I've written about the Texas Republic since I was in grad school. It was my first book was on the Texas Republic, and I've written on annexation a lot, even before this book. And the answer to your question is they were overwhelmingly in favor of annexation when it first came up in 1838, and they still were overwhelmingly in favor of it in 1845. And the only people that I can find as a group that are specifically against annexation are some Galveston merchants, because as far as they were concerned, Texas was coming out of the Depression of the late 30s and 40s, and they thought, you know what, we can pull this off. Everybody else, I mean, they looked at Texas as something of a failed state. It had been just bankrupt almost the entire time, subject to Native American raiding and Mexican invasions. I mean, San Jacinto was not the last chapter of that story of conflict between Mexicans and Anglos. It was just 10 years or 9.5 years of chaos, and people were tired of it. So that's the answer to your question. Okay.
Real quick, what was the status of Santa Anna? What was he in the Mexican government? Was he the president of Mexico?
Oh, he was president of Mexico.
Okay. The other question I have is, if we want to audit your course, okay, is that hard to do, or can we just walk in?
Okay, I don't know what the rule is. I can just tell you what my rule is. That's fine. Does UTA have a problem with this? To be honest, the parking alone would discourage you. Okay, the visitor parking is a nightmare there. But if you wanted to attend a class, you could always email me. I'd be happy to see what I could do. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Sam, thank you for the speech today. And in honor of your presentation, we're going to put a book at McShane Elementary in your honor.
Oh, great. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. So next Friday, Keith Randall Duncan will be our speaker. Oh, Sam, we'll get a picture real quick. Sam?
And while we're waiting for a picture, there are books on the table. If there's a book at your table and it is not taken and you're a Texas history buff, take it.
Thanks, Holly. Next week, Keith Randall Duncan will be speaking on the movie incident, and Mark Neese will be our chair of the day. Valerie Palin will now come up and do our four-way test.
Thank you. Join me in the four-way test of the things we think, say, or do. First is the truth. Second is fair to all concerned. Third, will it build goodwill and better friendship? And fourth, will be beneficial to all concerned. And where do I, where? Oh, I did it.